How about now? Behold the voice of the Lord. No. If you'll be turning to Revelation chapter 14 is where we are going to be studying from tonight, and I'm going to try, although I don't know that I will. I'm going to try to get all the way through Revelation 14 tonight because, or at least down to a certain section where he kind of shifts gears a little bit, because, of course, next Wednesday night, being Thanksgiving Eve, we will not have Bible class. We'll have a singing in here on that night, and I hope that you will. Sometimes in some congregations, singing nights are considered a little bit less important, but I think they're pretty important. I've heard people say, well, I just don't like to sing. Well, I'm afraid you're not going to like eternity very much because that's what we're going to be doing a lot of is singing. But anyway, I hope you'll be here for that. I know it'll be an encouraging and upbuilding night. And in this series of, or this time of year where we're thinking about being thankful, I'm thankful for all of you and thankful for your being here tonight and ready to study Revelation. And we're going to continue Sunday morning talking about about Thanksgiving, and maybe that's why I've been thinking about this all day. But I really am thankful for all of y'all, and I'm thankful to be here, and thankful to be your preacher, and thankful for all of God's blessings on us. And Revelation is one of those studies that is a little bit difficult, but hopefully, as we've studied together, it's made a little bit of sense to you, or I've tried to make it make a little bit of sense. Sometimes I know what I'm trying to say, but I don't express it very well. And but I'm hoping that it's getting across to you. I was telling some of them I had to go. I've been having trouble with my neck, and I went back to the doctor the other day, and he said, well, how's it been going? And I said, well, I've been having a time with it. And then I thought in my head, but that's better than having a time times and half a time, I guess. So having a time is better than having a time times and half a time. So anyway, we're not going to deal with that as much tonight as we're going to look back at the 144,000. So it seems like there's always math to do in Revelation somehow or another, but we'll try to get through it. So in Revelation chapter 14 is where we're at, and we're going to talk about Babylon falling. Somebody asked if Babylon Falls was a resort that you could go to, and you probably could, but probably not a lot of good outcomes come from there. That's what we're going to see tonight. But in verse 1 of chapter 14, he says, Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. And who's the Lamb? Jesus. And with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. Well, if you'll go back to chapter 3, this idea of having his name and the Father's name on their forehead, in chapter 3 and verse 12, back in the letters to the 7 congregations, he says, The one who conquers, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, never shall he go out of it, and I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which comes down from my God out of heaven, and my own new name. So Jesus had said, I'm going to write God's name, the Father's name, and my name on them. So that's what he's saying here in chapter 14 and verse 1. They've got the name of the Father on their foreheads and the name of the Lamb on their foreheads. And then if you go over to chapter 7, in chapter 7 and verse 3, you have the same idea. He says, Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. And then in verse 4 of chapter 7, there he mentions the 144,000 that we're going to talk about tonight in chapter 14 a little bit. So again, we keep going back to Old Testament passages that use the same kind of language or metaphors to talk about different things, as does John in the Revelation. And we keep noticing throughout all of Revelation, all of these different scenes or visions or movies that we're watching, how that he keeps using some of these things he just keeps using over and over and over again. And the power of a passage is one thing, but the power of seeing it over and over and over again in different passages is another thing, because it helps us see that we're on solid ground and that we're seeing the forest and not just focusing in so much on one tree that we're not seeing the big picture. So these individuals that he talks about here. And then in verse 2, he says that he heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on the harps. So how can it be like water and thunder and harpists playing on harps all at the same time? Well, he's telling us how powerful that this voice sounded when he talks about the sound of loud thunder and many waters, and how melodious it sounds when he's talking about the harpists playing on their harps. So it's a heavenly voice like we saw back in chapter 1. We saw it in chapter 10. That is the voice coming from heaven. That is one that he's supposed to pay attention to. And then he says that as he's hearing this voice, that they were singing a new song. They were singing a new song. We sing a song. They sing in heaven a new song of Moses and the Lamb, right? So if you'll go back to chapter 5, we've already seen this before, but in chapter 5 of Revelation, and that heavenly scene that he's describing in Revelation 5, in Revelation chapter 5, verses 9 and 10, he says, "Then they sang a new song, saying, Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation, and you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth." Of course, they're talking about the Lamb who was worthy to open the seals, but they're singing here in this heavenly scene, they're singing a new song. Well, back over here in Revelation 14, these people are singing that same new song. In chapter 5, it is the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders and those that are gathered around the throne are singing this new song. And now all of these others, he says, are singing that same new song. He says here in chapter 14 that they're singing that new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. So again, it's that same scene that we saw back in chapter 5 of Revelation, this throne room scene that he's described around the great throne of God. There's the 4 living creatures, remember, that had the 4 different faces and really weird looking things. And then there's the 24 elders that are surrounding and all that. They're singing the new song. They're here in chapter 14. They're singing the new song with them in that heavenly throne room scene. And he says that no one could learn to sing that song except for the 144,000 that had been redeemed from the earth. That's the only ones who could sing the song, was the 144,000 that redeemed from the earth. Well, who are they? He tells you the 144,000 are the ones who are redeemed from the earth. But that's not the only thing that we've learned about the 144,000. If you go back again to chapter 5, what we read just a few moments ago, and in chapter 5, verse 9, he says, "You were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God." So in chapter 14, he says they were redeemed or bought back from the earth. And then here in chapter 5, verse 9, he says that by the blood of the Lamb, they were ransomed back or bought back for God. And then here in chapter 5, verse 9, he says that this group is from every tribe and language and people and nation. You see those connections from here to chapter 14? I'm not making that up, right? He's saying the same thing. So they were purchased from the earth, and they is the 144,000. Now, when you get to the next verse, in verse 4, you'll notice these and they and these and these, and you need to put a little box around them. The these, they, these, and connect that back up to the 144,000, because the these, they, these is the 144,000. Now, some of y'all are looking at me like I've lost my mind or my hair's falling out. I don't know which it is. My hair is falling out a little bit, but it's over time. But the these, they, these is back up to the previous verse, verse 3, the 144,000. And because these are the 144,000 who are singing the new song, remember we talked about in chapter 5 that it's not a literal number, 144,000. Maybe you've had people that have knocked on your door that wants to study the Bible with you. When they find out that I'm a Church of Christ preacher, they don't usually want to study the Bible with me much more. They just want to give me their literature and leave. But sometimes they will. And they want to talk about the 144,000. And that's all that God is going to save, is 144,000. I don't know if they think the blood is going to run out at that point or what it is, but they think it's a literal number. And we talked about back in chapter 5, it's not a literal number, because you remember he says they're from the 12 tribes, and the 12 tribes' names were different than they ever were in the Old Testament. And the numbers were all the same, 12,000 in each tribe, and nowhere in the Old Testament were they numbered to be the same number in every tribe. And Nathan and I were talking today about, in a Bible class, he was teaching about how that the Israel that God is going to save is not literally the Jewish people that are in the land of Egypt right now. And he said a woman in the congregation literally went, shocked that was the case. It's not literal things that he's talking about. This is a metaphoric comparison that he's making here. These 144,000, remember, is 12 times 12 times 10 times 10. And these are the one times 10 times 10 times 10. These are the ones that God has, Jesus has purchased from the earth, that have the name of the Father on them. The Lamb's name is on their foreheads. These are the people that belong to God, see. And then he says, it is these who have not... Now this is going to help us understand who these 144,000 are, or who they represent. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Now, does that mean that they've never been married or never had any kind of relations? Is that what he means? The only people that God's going to save are the ones who never get married, never have any kind of relations. Well, there's a bunch of us in the room saying, well, I hope that's not the case, right? Well, of course not. Is there anywhere previously to this, before chapter 14, that we've read about someone that people could have committed fornication with? Do you remember? Remember back in the letters to the churches, and he talked about the fornication that they had committed with Jezebel? And it wasn't literally that they had committed fornication with Jezebel, but it was spiritual fornication. Well, when we get further on, and we'll look over at this passage here in just a little bit if we have time, but over in chapter 17, he's going to talk about the great harlot. And so that's what's involved here, I think, is he's talking about the 144,000 are the ones that belong to God, because they've not committed spiritual fornication with the great harlot. They hadn't cheated on the Lord in their relationship with Him. Now, how many times in the Old Testament did we see that metaphor God use about His people? That you've committed spiritual adultery, you've committed spiritual harlotry. because they were worshiping another god or worshiping something else besides God. And it's the same thing that's involved here. He says it is these who follow the Lamb wherever He goes. So these are the ones that are committed to following Jesus no matter what. Okay? And it's easy to say, I'm going to follow you. Remember, Peter said, well, we're going to follow you. The rest of the disciples also said, we're going to follow. We'd never desert you. We'd never leave you, even if it means death. And Jesus says, are you really ready to take the cup that I'm about to? Well, they said it, but they weren't ready at that point. But later on, they would be. But the 144,000 are those that are redeemed by God. They haven't committed spiritual adultery. They're the ones who are dedicated to following Jesus, whatever it costs. Wherever He goes, they're going to go. Are you still with me? Yes, no? And then He says, these have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. So they've been purchased with the blood of Jesus. They belong to God. They belong to Jesus. Okay? So that's a whole lot to think about with the 144,000. But He's not done describing them. Verse 5, you've got the there and the they, put a box around that and connect it back to the these, they, these. And the 144,000, we're still talking about the same group of people. He says, in their mouth, the 144,000, no lie was found. Now, I don't think that He's talking about, of all the things He could talk about, I don't think He's saying that they're honest people and never lie. In the context of Revelation, the lie that they were being tempted to say or to tell was that Caesar was God. Okay? That was the lie that they were constantly being asked to tell. They bring the bust in the middle of the town square. You go down there. You say, Caesar is God. I worship only Caesar. He's above everything. That's a lie, because Caesar's not a God. Okay? And if they were going to save themselves from being put to death, from dying, that's the lie that they were going to have to tell. But in their mouth, that lie wasn't found. They weren't willing to make that declaration, that lie, in order to save their skins. He says, for they are blameless. So that description of all of these things, you put it all together, has a lot of points. So I got thinking about all the things that He said about the 144,000. And here's all the things that He said about the 144,000. They've been sealed. They're from every tribe. They had the Lamb and the Father's name on their forehead. They're singing the new song that nobody else can sing. They're redeemed from the earth. They've not committed spiritual adultery. They follow the Lamb. They're not lying about Caesar, and they're blameless. Now, all of those things have to go into our interpretation of who the 144,000 are. So what group of people fit those descriptions? Christians, God's people, right? Faithful members of the assembly of God. That's it, the family of God. So it's not a literal 144,000. It's showing you that 12 times 12, the 12s mean they belong to God. You got the 10 tens, it's the perfect number. In other words, if I'm all of those things, God's not going to say, oh, I forgot, we were supposed to bring Johnny Shanklin with us. Where did he go? That's not going to happen. Okay? And the perfect number would not be 144,000 literally. The perfect number would be everyone who fits this description. Right? So it's not like, you'll see these things where the first 1,000 people that call gets 15%, and I'm 1,001. And they're like, well, we're sorry you missed it by... every year, if you listen to the Rick and Bubba show, now the Rick Burgess show, they do this thing at Christmas time where the 12 days of Christmas, and they give all these Christmas prizes away, and it's always some big number. They'll be like, we're going to take the 127th caller because, this is our, 120th gift we've given out this year, or whatever. 127th caller, and they'll just go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, hanging up on, and then they'll finally get to like 126, and they'll say, "Hello, Rick and Bubba Show," and there'll be some guy saying, "Yeah, I called about the prize." "Well, I'm sorry, you're 126. And that guy's like, "Dog." And then 127, and you've won, and they go on. And then they hang up with him. They say, "All right, you want to have some fun?" And then they hit the next button, and they say, "Rick and Bubba Show. Yeah, I was calling about the Christmas prize package. Man, wouldn't it be great to have that?" "Yeah, man, I've been wanting one of them all my life." "Well, Merry Christmas. I'm sorry, you're 128. Pull the rug right out from underneath. And they'll do that to 128 and 129 and 130 until it's time for a commercial break. And well, God's not going to do that. He's not going to say, "Well, I'm sorry, Justin, you're 144,001. That you just missed it. It's the ones that meet the description that he's talking about here, the ones that get to be with the Lord. So, verse 6, he says, "Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead with an eternal gospel to proclaim to those who dwell on the earth." Now, we've talked about this phrase, "those who dwell on the earth," and we've talked about all along that these are the bad guys. If you're studying it in the Greek, you would see that this is not the same phrase that has been translated, "those who dwell on the earth," every other time. So I don't think it's the bad guy people. But even if you don't know Greek, you can figure it out because in this verse, they're the ones who are being proclaimed the gospel to. So these aren't the bad guys that have already made up their mind. They're not part of the 144,000. These would be the people, those who dwell on the earth, that aren't committed to Jesus yet, but they're also not committed to worshiping Caesar and are anti-Jesus. You with me? So the gospel is being proclaimed to them. If God has already made up His mind that there's 144,000 and this is the 144,000 and there's nobody but the 144,000, why are we proclaiming the gospel? I've always wondered. This chapter, by the way, is one of the ones that those who believe in Calvinist doctrines will go to a lot because of this. There's a certain number, God's already decided who's going to be saved and who's not. And it is true that the Bible says He's predetermined who is going to be saved and who's not. What He's predetermined is those who fit in the category or who don't. If you're in Jesus, you're saved. If you're not in Jesus, you're not. He hasn't decided Johnny's saved, Ron's not. Johnny and Ron, you're too close there. Johnny's saved and Ron's not. That's not what He's decided. He's decided everybody in Jesus, everybody who's not in Jesus. That's the distinction. Okay? So we're proclaiming the gospel because we get to choose which of those categories that we get to be in. So he's proclaiming the gospel here to every nation and tribe and language and people. There's that phrase again. Not the time, times, and half a time phrase, but here's another phrase that's over and over. Every nation and tribe and language and people. We saw it back in chapter 13. We saw it back in chapter 5, verses 9 and 10. But it comes directly from, and we've saw this already, from the book of Daniel. So, verse 7, he said, this angel, says with a loud voice, "Fear God and give Him glory." Fear God and give God glory. See, we learned at the end of chapter 13 that the beast was just a man. Remember, the beast has the number of a man because the beast is a man. So, what he's saying here is fear God and give Him glory. But in other words, what he's saying is don't fear man and give him glory. Okay? Remember, one of the big ideas of this whole book is worship God only. So fear God and give Him glory. Not men. Fear God and give Him glory. Because, he says, the hour of His judgment has come. And worship Him who made water and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So if you go back to chapter 4, in chapter 4, in verse 11, he says a very similar thing that we've already seen a few weeks back. In chapter 4 and verse 11, it says, "Worthy are you, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power." Why? Why is God worthy to receive glory and honor and power? He says, because you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. That's the same thing he's saying back here in chapter 14. Instead of worshiping men, the created, you should worship God, the Creator. Now in Romans chapter 1, you remember that's one of the things that he said about them is they worship the thing that was created rather than the Creator. They worshiped man, a created being. So this angel comes on the scene and he says, don't worship men who are created, worship God, who is the Creator of heaven and earth and the water and everything, all the other things that are in those things. And then in verse 8, another angel, a second angel appears. Another angel, a second, followed, saying, here's his message, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." So this is announcing the fall of Babylon the Great, which we talked about at the very beginning is kind of the main crux here that we're noticing. Announcing the fall of Babylon the Great. Babylon the Great in chapter 17, and we'll notice some of these verses in just a moment, but in chapter 17, Babylon the Great is synonymous with Rome. So, if you'll turn back to the Old Testament, you're tired of me saying that, I know, but turn back to the Old Testament, to Isaiah chapter 21. Isaiah 21, and look down at verse 9. Isaiah 21 and verse 9 says, "And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs, and he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon. And all the carved images of her gods he shattered to the ground." See, back at this time, when Isaiah is writing, Babylon was the great enemy of God's people. And Babylon was the big bad city. And it was Babylon that was going to destroy Jerusalem, and it was Babylon that was going to carry her inhabitants off and punish them and persecute them and all that. But now, in the time we're reading about, in Revelation 14, at the end of the first century, when John is on Patmos having this vision, Babylon is a long ago forgotten power. It's no longer one of the big boys. It's no longer a powerful empire, much less a powerful city by the time you get to the Roman Empire. So the Babylon he's talking about in our day is Rome. Because Rome, like Babylon back in the Old Testament days, Rome is going to be the one that's going to destroy Jerusalem, is going to carry off its people, is going to persecute God's people. See? I don't know if we pointed this out earlier, but in 1 Peter 5, Peter says, "Those that are in Babylon greet you." Well, Peter wasn't in Babylon. He was in Rome. And it's the people of Rome that he's talking about, the Christians in Rome, that were greeting him. So, if you turn over, go back to Revelation, and if you turn over to chapter 17, and in Revelation chapter 17, look down at verse 5, and he's talking about the great harlot here. So in Revelation 17 and verse 5, he says, "On her forehead," that's the great harlot's forehead, "on her forehead was written a name of mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of prostitutes and of earth's abominations." And then if you scroll on down a little bit more to Revelation 18 and verse 2, "And he called out with a mighty voice, Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great." And then you go down to verse 10. "Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city, Babylon, For in a single hour your judgment has come. And then verse 21, so will Babylon, the great city. So you see this over and over again. Well, the great city in this time is Rome. And it's the one that's causing everyone to commit spiritual adultery. But this phrase, Babylon the Great, or Babylon the great city, is going to be repeated over and over in Revelation. It becomes something that's very focused on. So the first angel comes on the scene, and the first angel says, you better not be giving man fear and glory. You better only give God fear and glory. And then the second angel says that what you're worshiping in Babylon isn't even going to last. It's going to fall. So think about like Daniel 3 as being a touchstone here. In Daniel 3, you remember Nebuchadnezzar builds this big statue or whatever it was, and everybody's supposed to worship it. Okay? And everybody does, except for Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they refuse to. If you don't, you're going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. And those 3 Hebrew children were thrown in the fiery furnace. And God saved them out of it and all of that. But all of those people that were worshiping that one thing that Nebuchadnezzar had built, how long did it last? Well, Nebuchadnezzar's going to die. And then Belshazzar is going to take the throne. And he's going to be killed. And that's the end. Then what happened? So why would you, that's why he says, they tell Nebuchadnezzar, God can choose to save us or He may not, but He's still God. He's the only thing we can worship. We can't worship something that's temporary. We're going to worship something that's permanent. We want to be a part of the kingdom that's never going to end. See, that's the point that he's trying to make here. Why would you worship something that's temporary? So the first angel says, only worship God, don't worship men. Second angel comes along and says, because Babylon is going to fall. So why would you want to worship something that's temporary instead of something that's permanent? It says that she, back over in chapter 14, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. Okay? So they've committed fornication, spiritual adultery, with Babylon or Rome. But the follower of Jesus, who was loyal, they've not committed fornication because they've not been unfaithful to Jesus. So, verse 9, another angel, a third. How many angels are there running around that place? A third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image, and that's all the stuff that we talked about back in chapter 13, and receives a mark on his forehead or on his hand. So instead of having the mark of the Father and the Lamb, he's got the mark of the beast. Okay? So if anyone worships the beast and has his mark on his forehead, he says that very person, there we are. That very person, he says, will also drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of His anger. Now, to understand what he's saying here, you got to understand how wine was drunk in the first century. They would mix their wine with water. So you would have 1 part wine and 1 part water, or you would have 1 part wine and 2 parts water, or 1 part wine and 3 parts water, or whatever. And the reason that they did that was to cut it and make it not as potent. Okay? They're trying to weaken the wine so that it wouldn't become intoxicating. Okay? That's table wine, they would call it. That's what they would do. It was weakened. You're not going to get drunk on weakened wine. Okay? But he says you're going to drink the wine of God's wrath poured out full strength in the cup of His anger. In other words, God's wrath is not going to be weakened. You're going to get all of it. Not a part of it, not a weakened down, watered down version of it. You're going to get all of it, 100%, full strength. And he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and the presence of the Lamb. That word that's translated torment is a Greek word that means to be severely tortured. The reason that I bring that up is because there's a somewhat popular theory that has come up in theology through the years, the annihilation doctrine, that basically says if you don't go to heaven, God throws you in the lake of fire and you're burned up and it's done and you're over with. That's the annihilation doctrine. It's not good because you don't get to go to heaven, but in the grand scheme of things, you're just snuffed out and that's it. But this passage makes it exceedingly, and there's a lot of other passages in the Bible that does, but this passage makes it exceedingly clear that that's not what's going to happen. He says that you're going to be tormented in a long-term kind of way. And so he continues in verse 11, and the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast in His image, and whoever receives the mark of His name. So again, the annihilation doctrine is not true because they have no rest. Burning would be bad, but eventually it's over, right? If you're annihilated. But they have no rest at all. By the way, verses 10 and 11 here are maybe the worst descriptions in the Bible on hell. But they totally destroy the annihilation theory. And then you need to put a big box around this verse, verse 12. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. So put a big star, a big circle, however you want to put all of it if you want to, because it's a really important idea. Why do I want to stay faithful to God and to Jesus? It's because I don't want to burn in the lake of fire forever and ever, having no rest day and night. It'd be bad. Now, a lot of people don't want to preach or teach what I'm preaching and teaching to you right now. Okay? And the reason that a lot of people don't want to preach and teach this is because most people in the church don't want to hear this. But this is the message of the New Testament. Yes, it's about the love of God and the mercy of God and the grace of God and all of that, but if you turn your back on Him, if you turn your back on His offer of salvation and you reject it, what you've got left for your looking forward to is hellfire and damnation. And I don't like it, but I didn't write it. I'm just reporting it. Okay? So that's the way it is. So here is the patience of the saints. That's the same phrase we saw back in chapter 13 and verse 10. And we jumped ahead over here to chapter 14 and saw this. But same phrase you saw in chapter 13 and verse 10, the patience of the saints or the endurance of the saints. But also notice the similarity here in verse 12 of those who keep the commandments of God and faith in Jesus. And flip back or scroll back, whatever you're doing here, and look at chapter 12 and verse 17 when it's talking about the dragon. And who's the dragon? Satan or the devil. Notice what he says in chapter 12 and verse 17. Then the dragon became furious with the woman, and he went off to make war on the rest of her offspring. Notice this, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Notice how similar that sounds to keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. You with me? See, I like to be able to put my finger on it, and I like to be able to say, here it is, and here it is again, and here it is again, and here it is again. And you can listen to whoever you want to or read whatever you want to, but you know, again, here it is, and here it is again, and here it is again, and that's solid because it is what the Bible says. It isn't what somebody thinks it is what the Bible says. And if you study the Bible in that way, then it's difficult for people to argue with you because you're just standing on what the Bible says. So, you've got these three angels that have come out. One has given us a warning to worship God, not to fear or worship man, but fear and worship God alone. The second one said, Babylon the Great is fallen. And the third says that those who do worship the emperors or the beast, they're going to burn forever and ever. But on the other hand, as Randy Travis would sing, you don't hear that. On the other hand, he says, I heard a voice from heaven saying, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. So a couple things here. The dead that die in the Lord in this passage and in this context, this is a verse that we will talk about a lot, but maybe not in the context of it. But the dead that die in the Lord in this passage and context are those who don't worship the beast. They're those who are faithful to the Lord. They're those who keep the commandments of God. And certainly it would apply to anyone else who dies in the Lord today. But the point that he's making here is if you're going to die, you better die in the Lord. Okay? So who in here is going to die? Probably all of us. All of us are going to be changed at least, but probably all of us are going to die. So if you're going to die, you better die in the Lord, is what he's saying. So that's one thing. But then notice where he says, from now on. And if you'll jump back real quick to chapter 6, in Revelation chapter 6, from now on, he says, blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Back in chapter 6 and verse 11, he says, and we talked about this, but these are the saints who had been put to death in persecution. In chapter 6 and verse 11, it says, then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brothers should be complete, who were to be killed as they themselves had been. So just like they died in service of the Lord, there's going to be others that are going to die in this persecution, in this great tribulation. And then he says, blessed are those who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit. That reminds me of back in the letters when he said, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And he said that over and over in chapters 2 and 3. And then the last thing, he says they'll have rest from their labors. So when they die, they get to rest from their labors. And their deeds do follow them. So you remember in the letters in chapters 2 and 3, how there were some people that he said your first works were greater than your latter works, and you need to repent and do the first works. Remember that? And then there were some that said your latter works were greater than your first works. Well, here he says their works follow after them. And that is an important concept to me. Lots of things that I wish I could do and wish I could do better, but one of the things that I think about a lot is what kind of spiritual legacy am I living? You know, maybe I don't know if I'm going through a midlife crisis or what it is. I'm just being honest with y'all. I don't know if I'm going through a midlife crisis or not, but at 51, I'm starting to think about, like, what is really the motivation for what I do in everything. Back in the 90th Psalm, which is the one psalm that we know that Moses wrote, the very last phrase in the 90th Psalm, let me get down there to it. The very last phrase says, establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. That was his prayer to God. That's the same psalm in which he said that, you know, what's a man's life? 70 years, maybe 80 years. So, when I think about a spiritual legacy, have there been souls that have been changed because of what I've done or what I've allowed God to do through me? Are there lives that have been altered? Are there people that have been saved and influenced? Because when we're gone, and we're all going to be gone one day, That's the meaning of life. If your life matters, he says back here in Revelation 14, if your life matters, then your deeds will follow you into the next world, and that will be good. And I think about what kind of spiritual legacy am I leaving? It doesn't matter how much money I have. It doesn't matter what kind of car I drive. It doesn't matter how many ducks or deer I kill. It doesn't matter what kind of trophies I have in my cabinet. It doesn't matter all those things. What kind of spiritual legacy am I leaving? And that's the idea here. Now, we didn't get all the way through chapter 14, but we did get at least to the kind of the breaking point. You notice he says, then I looked. So there's a different vision coming on, and this next one is kind of weird anyway, so we'll spend some time on it in a couple of weeks looking at that. But I want you to think about what kind of spiritual legacy are you leaving? He's trying to tell them, make sure you're making your choices based on what the eternal outcome is going to be. And that's what we need to do as well. That make sense? All right. So we'll mark there, and we'll begin back in chapter 14 in a couple of weeks. Those of you that are online with us, thank you for joining us tonight. Hope you can be with us in person this Sunday, and we can enjoy fellowship together face to face. Those of you that are here, as Nathan's getting all that turned off, we've got a few announcements that we want to make you aware of.